One topic of particular interest to these monks was the study of cosmology. I just decided to start with more local cosmology, the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun. I also very much believe in hands-on activities to teach those concepts. So using a ping pong ball and a thumbtack, they explored the phases of the Moon. They also explored the distance between the Sun, Earth, and Moon. They were very excited and very interested to learn that they all hold some very common misconceptions about the distance of these objects, and they were very excited to practice teaching these concepts to their own students. We also learned about the seasons, and using styrofoam balls and using a skewer, they were able to model the Earth's axis tilt, and again its distance away from the sun, to see for themselves that what causes the changes of the seasons is the amount of daylight that you receive and also the height of the sun in the sky. And they loved the idea that you could just teach that concept using very, very simple materials. So by the end of my time with them, they not only learned cosmology in terms of the sun and the stars and the galaxies and the relationships between all of those objects to each other. What's more important, they learned how to teach those concepts to students. What's the best way to guide students through a study of the universe that makes sense to students, that allows them to conceptualize these incredibly large and incredibly distant objects? One thing I wanted to show the monks was what the seasons are like in different parts of the globe, not just in their location in India, but what about North America? What about the Antarctic and Arctic regions? And that was very interesting to them to think about what the seasons might be like on other parts of the Earth. There are a lot of reasons to learn cosmology. For the monks, of course, it's because the understanding of their place in the universe is so very important and fundamental to their religion. As human beings, we just have this basic set of questions that we always worry about. One of them is, what is the universe? What's my place in the universe? How did it begin? How will it end? We also had the opportunity to draw a sun to scale. The model was, imagine that the Earth is the size of a hole punched out of a little piece of paper. How large would the sun then be? And using that model, they drew out a paper sun. Then the question is, once you have a model of the sun, how far apart is that circle compared to the little hole punch that you punched out, which represents the size of the Earth? And we took those models outside and actually had to separate them quite a distance, which was very surprising to them. We took a look at the distance between the Earth and the Moon, something people don't really think a lot about. So the distance between the Earth and Moon was accomplished by having them first find two objects that they thought were the right size for the Earth and Moon. Then, what about taking those two objects and separating them so it's the proper distance? Most of the monks thought that the Earth and Moon were very close together and were surprised to find out that if you take 30 of those little earth marbles and lay them end to end, that gives you the distance to the Moon.
Bir is a small community located at the foot of the Himalayas, a Tibetan community surrounded by an agricultural Indian community. Our institute took place at a beautiful location called Deer Park Institute, which was a former Tibetan Buddhist monastery. We have an exhibit on the floor of the Exploratorium called Visible Effects of the Invisible, which helps us see the effects of sound vibration. We made a membrane by stretching a piece of saran wrap over a cup with a rubber band. We pulled the saran wrap so it was quite tight across the opening of the cup, and then we sprinkled a very unmassive, very lightweight material. I had parsley flakes with me in my luggage, and we put some parsley flakes on top of this membrane. I then asked the monks to make some loud noises, see if we could see the effects of sound vibration. I borrowed some materials from the kitchen at Deer Park Institute to use for this experiment. When the monks saw that I was using a metal plate and a metal spoon, they tried to do the same thing with a paper plate, and we found that was not a very effective strategy. The coolest experiment that they tried was one of the monks tried his throat singing. Together. Sound cups is an activity I learned from my friends Karen and Mike. And even though it looks like a sound experiment, it's really an opportunity to engage in a scientific exploration. At first, I gave each of the monks a pair of cups that were taped together, and they could not see what was inside the cups. Each cup pair had a match somewhere in the room, and the first thing the monks had to do was to find their match, just by listening, feeling the heft of the cups. Once they thought they found their matched pair, their next assignment was to try and build a cup that sounded exactly like the one that I had prepared. I brought them a suite of materials and asked them to try and make a match to the one that they had in their hands. The scientific method is not a step 1 through step 10 kind of procedure. There's a lot of going back and forth. And so this was an opportunity for the monks to have a scientific investigation using pretty easy materials. This seems like a pretty odd thing to do, except it's a really good way for us to see a structure on the tongue called the fungiform papillae. We were counting the fungiform papillae to find out who amongst us were tasters, super tasters, or non-tasters. In this experiment, the monks painted their tongues blue and identified a small area of the tongue in which to count the fungiform papillae. It turns out that people who have a lot of fungiform papillae are in a group called super tasters. Super tasters are people that find a lot of bitter foods almost unbearably bitter. About 25% of the general population are super tasters. About 50% are tasters, and another 25% are non-tasters. I had the monks take their data and present it visually in a histogram made out of Post-it notes. One of the things that I really like to do when I'm teaching science is use the data from our experiments to tell the story of what we're finding out. Mathematics is the language of science, and I wanted the monks to see that there are simple ways that we can integrate mathematics into the science that we're teaching.
One of the interesting things about the monks teaching these types of activities is that it allowed us to reflect on our own teaching practices. So here in the U.S., when we share some of these activities, we might do them in 2 or 3 hours. With the monks, those 2 or 3 hour activities turned into activities that lasted 2 or 3 days. And so I'm curious to see how much that's extended once they start to truly understand more about what they were doing with us and how they translate that to the students that they're working with.
Just giving them that experience of being really physical with the materials and figuring out motions and the way things work. It's a really active way of thinking about how you imagine things working and then actually trying it out yourself. And it was really terrific to see them come up with things we didn't expect and figure out things in really imaginative ways.
Actually, you started to get to the practice of figuring out a hypothesis and then ways of disproving or proving that hypothesis, which is, of course, part of the process of science. Little did I know that in their tradition, this is something they are trained to do. So,
one of my goals was to help them find more ways to teach the science in a hands-on way. Their tradition is much more lecture-based. This is a challenge for them, and it's something new for them. And I'm delighted that I was able to help them think about how to do this in their own monasteries.
Like beginning science teachers back in the States, they tended to rely a little bit on lecturing. And that made complete sense to me because beginning teachers are often a little uncomfortable letting sort of control go of the class and letting the class do inquiry on their own. And so it also wasn't surprising to me when every time they taught the class, they loosened up a little more and a little more. They were willing to give up control to the students ever so slightly every time they repeated the lesson to another group, until at the end of the days, these monks were starting to let the students kind of take over and grab the marbles and grab the objects and try to figure out some of these ideas on their own.
So I would say all in all, it was an incredibly successful experience on both sides. I mean, we learned a tremendous amount about ourselves from the monks, and I think they learned a lot about the Exploratorium's approach to teaching and inquiring about the world around them, and I think everybody came out on top in the end.